Okay. My name is Brian Martinez, Honey Badger Radio. Hey, Derek, what's up? This question is for Marissa. Marissa, I couldn't help but hear some of the language you were using when you were talking about how to address the issues of white supremacy and achieving equality and so on. And it sounds like, and I don't want to misinterpret anything that you're saying, but it sounds like you are calling for something of a revolutionary change and shifting people towards the left, the conversation towards the left. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to know is what would it look like in the U.S. if you accomplished your goals? What would the United States look like? What is your goal ultimately?
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll end in that question. We kind of had this conversation a little bit when we were getting ready for the panel talking to speak. Well, one of the things is, the piece about living in community with each other is that whatever the world is going to look like after we make certain changes, that's going to be a collective decision, right? So part of the reason why I won't be able to say, like, this is how it's gonna, you might agree with this, we're always trying to, enforce a system on other people, right? And what I think we all sort of would want is collectively us deciding, the real question is, how do we want to live together? And that might look something different than what we've ever seen before, right? There was a time when the United States didn't exist. There was a time when capitalism didn't exist. All of these things were sort of invented. And so if you look amongst Black activists and Black revolutionaries that I work with, all of us are dealing with the problem of white supremacy and trying to answer the question of how do we fix this? But people have a wide range of views, and I'm still progressing in my views. I tend to lean more towards Pan-African socialism right now, but that's just where I am. But acknowledging that the Black folks are not a monolith, and there's a bunch of different views around that, and there might be some compromises that we decide on when we actually get to the places where we're able to just end the violence that's happening now.
After independence, our leaders never went back to their old traditional institutions, never went back to their roots to build upon their own indigenous institutions. Instead, they transplanted alien institutions into Africa. And this is important. And in doing so, they betrayed their own cultural heritage. The two most defective institutions they introduced into Africa were the economic institutions systems and political systems. First, the economic institutions. They argued that colonialism was evil and exploitative. And because the colonialists said they were capitalists, it meant that capitalism too was evil and exploitative. So they rejected capitalism and borrowed socialism, the antithesis of capitalism. Now this is how they argued. That only socialism will save Africa. This was back in the 60s. But guess what type of socialism they implemented in Africa? They implemented a peculiar form of Swiss bank socialism, which allowed the head of state and his cohort of ministers to rip and plunder African treasuries for deposit in Switzerland. One of the cabinet ministers in Zimbabwe was once asked to define socialism. And he said, here in Zimbabwe, socialism means what is mine, but what is yours, we share. Under socialism, Africa's economy were controlled. The state demanded for itself ownership of the economy and participation in the economy. And it led to the institution and the imposition of a plethora of state controls and regulations on the economy, and the operation of a whole lot of state-owned enterprises. Back then, the drift towards statism, or socialism, or statism as, state control over the economy, was driven by ideology, but there were also pragmatic reasons. There were some countries like Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Kenya, for example, which did not adopt socialist ideology, but they had extensive government intervention in the economy for quote-unquote pragmatic reasons. They argue that if, say, Ivory Coast or Nigeria needed a dam, and the dam would cost something like $50 million, nobody in Nigeria had $50 million, so it was the state who had to build a dam. So this justified state intervention in the economy. Now, very soon, many of those who were operating the state controls discovered that the state controls created shortages. And when you create shortages, you create black markets. And when you create black markets, you always create an opportunity for somebody operating the controls to illicitly enrich himself. In Ghana, Nigeria, for example, those who wanted to import commodities had to get import license. And because the licenses were hard to get by because of import controls, they were willing to pay something under the table which went into the pocket of the ministers. The first mistake that was made was to set up this defective and alien economic system, which allowed the state to control almost every conceivable aspect of Africa's economy. Now, I'm coming down hard on this because this type of economic system can nowhere be justified by Africa's own indigenous economic system. If you go to any African village market today, chiefs do not fix prices. Prices are arrived at by bargaining. And you will also notice that women play a very important role, dominate market activity in Africa. Now contrast this with modern Africa, where price controls were imposed on almost many commodities in Africa, something which did not exist in traditional Africa. Now, that was the economic system. In the political system, the political systems established in post-colonial Africa were not democratic. Once again, the nationalist leaders argued that democracy was a Western invention or institution. And because they had rejected colonialism, they also rejected democracy. And therefore, many of them who had gone to the East and copied the systems in the East imposed upon their respective countries one-party state systems where no opposition parties were allowed, where the leader became president for life. Now, opposition parties were banished. Political dissent was also banished. So you had a political system, and get this, a political system which concentrated a great deal of power in the hands of one individual. As you know already, as a quote from Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So you have a political system in which power was concentrated in the hands of one individual and in the state, and you also have a defective economic system where power was concentrated in the hands of the state and ultimately in the hands of one individual. The combination of these defective economic and political systems led to the evolution of what I have written in this book as the pirate state or the mafia state. So that, of course, this did not evolve all of a sudden, but gradually over the post-colonial period. With the concentration of political and economic power in the hands of the state ceased to be a government as you and I understand it. Government as you and I understand it is government is by the people, for the people, etc., etc. Such a government doesn't exist in many African countries. What exists is a mafia state. That is a government which has been hijacked by thugs and crooks who use the instrument of state power to advance their own economic interests, to enrich themselves, their cronies, their kinsmen, and exclude everybody else. In other words, they have established in many African countries what you might call an economic apartheid system. It is important to understand this because this politics of exclusion is what lies at the root of the implosion of many African countries. Let me give you an example. And if you want to understand this, ask yourself, take the US and take Africa. Why is the US rich? Why is Africa poor? To understand this, ask yourself, how do the rich in the US and Africa get rich? The richest person here in the US is Bill Gates, with a personal fortune of 60 billion and counting. How did he make his money? In the private sector, in the computer industry, by producing software. In other words, there is something to show for his wealth. Now let's go to Africa. Who are the richest in Africa? The richest in Africa are heads of state and ministers. How did they make their money? By raking it off the backs of their suffering people. That doesn't generate any net wealth. In Africa, wealth is just redistributed from one section of the population to another section of the population, to the vampire elites. They don't generate any net wealth. They use the instruments of the state to enrich themselves, their cronies, and their kinsmen, and exclude everybody else. Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, the late Mobutu, was one of the richest Africa's kleptocrats. He had a personal fortune of 10 billion. When his country's foreign debt was 7 billion. Which meant that this one individual could write a check and pay off his country's entire foreign debt. Then there is Ibrahim Babangida of Nigeria, with a personal fortune of about 11 billion. Nigeria is the worst case in Africa. Nigeria, with its oil wealth, since 1970, more than 100 billion in oil revenue has flowed into Nigeria. And all that has been squandered. You can't blame the colonialists for this. You must blame the corrupt leaders that we've had in Nigeria. The late Abacha, for example, he was a guy who was in power for just 4 years. And yet he managed to accumulate a personal fortune of $5 billion. This is serious, and this is one of the reasons why Africans are angry.